Usually, like when we examine the breakdown of a marriage or, I don't know, a lifelong family bond, there's this ingrained expectation of a single explosive event.
Right, yeah, the cinematic climax.
Exactly. We look for that moment where someone throws a plate across the room or slams the front door, and then years later, you can point to that exact fraction of a second and say, there, that is the moment everything just shattered.
Well, we certainly prefer our historical narratives to follow that kind of neat binary structure. I mean, it provides a comforting illusion of control, right?
Oh, absolutely.
If we can isolate a specific turning point, we can easily categorize the before and the after, which, makes complex emotional or political shifts much easier to digest.
But the moment you step out of the realm of cinema and into the actual world of international geopolitics,
Yeah.
specifically the foundational bedrock relationship between the United States and Europe, well, that tidy script goes completely out the window.
It really does.
We are looking at a relationship breakdown that defies easy categorization. It's this slow, grinding, almost imperceptible erosion of mutual trust.
Yeah, I mean, it resembles a profound geopolitical midlife crisis, if you will.
Right.
It's the quiet, unsettling realization that the people living in the same house have, over the course of decades, evolved into entirely different people with fundamentally incompatible worldviews.
Welcome, everyone, to today's Deep Dive on Topic Lens. Today is Thursday, March 19th, 2026. And before we get into the core of today's analysis, we really have to acknowledge the intense global context we're currently navigating.
Yeah, we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
No, we really can't. For the past 2 days, we have been laser-focused on the highly volatile conflict escalating in the Middle East right now. We've analyzed Iran's maneuvers. We've examined Israel's strategic posture, and we've tracked how this regional instability has just completely rattled global trade routes.
Sparking a massive energy and gas market crisis.
Exactly. It's reverberating through every major economy. We are witnessing high-stakes geopolitics, where the margin for error is virtually non-existent.
And, the United States is undeniably the massive third player in that Middle Eastern equation. I mean, every single diplomatic and military maneuver in the region ultimately revolves around anticipating how Washington will react.
Right. And what kind of force Washington is actually willing to project.
Which brings us to a deliberate pivot for today's show. We are intentionally setting the immediate crisis in the Middle East aside for the moment. Because to truly grasp American actions on the global stage, whether that's in the Middle East, the South China Sea, or anywhere else, you have to understand the architecture of its most critical foundational alliance.
Yeah, you cannot understand the building without inspecting the foundation first.
Spot on. So today is part 2 of our comprehensive double deep dive into the transatlantic relationship between the U.S. and Europe.
And just to remind everyone, our overarching mission on Topic Lens remains constant, right? To function as objective analysts.
We're stripping away the national biases, the partisan talking points, the sensationalism. The goal here is to get past those explosive 24-hour news headlines to reveal the actual subtext of world politics.
We want to map the shifting tectonic plates beneath our feet, basically.
Yeah.
Because those unseen movements are what actually generate the earthquakes.
Exactly.
For those of you who joined us for part 1, we covered immense ground. We started by dismantling the myth of homogeneous blocs. We established that treating Europe as a single unified brain is just as flawed as assuming, like an Iowa farmer, a New Yorker, and a Texan share the exact same political priorities.
Right, the whole peach versus coconut dynamic we talked about.
Yeah, the cultural divide, that fascinating dynamic where America projects hard military power while Europe leans heavily into civilian diplomacy and institutional frameworks.
The Mars versus Venus concept.
Exactly. And we also tracked the structural tremors, particularly that massive economic divergence that began after the 2008 financial crisis. And, of course, the demographic shifts that are slowly turning America's strategic gaze away from the Atlantic and toward the Pacific.
So we essentially laid out the architectural blueprints of this alliance in the last part.
We did. And today we are walking through the actual rooms of the House. We're charting entirely new territory based on our historical and political source material.
We'll be analyzing the specific historical flashpoints that cracked the foundation, the internal identity crises that are currently tearing both continents apart from the inside.
The algorithmic echo chambers, which I find fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. The ones that actively distort our mutual perceptions, and ultimately the severe ongoing stress test of the war in Ukraine.
So the natural question for you listening is, why should you dedicate an hour to understanding transatlantic relations? Because honestly, the shifting of these specific tectonic plates dictates the reality of your daily life.
It really does. It dictates the global security architecture. It shapes the regulations governing the digital platforms you use every single day.
And it actively filters the very information fed to you on your smartphone.
Yeah.
So to transition from those abstract cultural differences we covered previously into the concrete reality of today, we need to pinpoint the historical moment those differences violently surfaced.
Right.
We need to examine the first major family scandal, the 2003 Iraq War.
Yeah, and to accurately contextualize 2003, we really must briefly rewind to 1991.
Okay, let's go back.
Because when the Soviet Union collapsed, the overarching adhesive of the transatlantic relationship just dissolved almost overnight.
Right, the boogeyman was gone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For over 40 years, the entire NATO alliance was predicated on a shared existential geographical threat. The Red Army was stationed just across the Fulda Gap in East Germany.
Right.
So when that immediate unifying terror evaporated, the foundational question for policymakers became deeply existential. Like, what is the actual purpose of this alliance in the absence of a shared enemy?
I imagine the immediate aftermath didn't feel like a crisis, though,
Yeah.
right? I mean, looking back at the mood of the 1990s, there was this overwhelming wave of liberal triumphalism.
Oh, definitely.
We had Francis Fukuyama famously declaring the end of history. The prevailing assumption was that Western liberal democracy and free market capitalism had just permanently won the ideological debate. NATO expanded eastward, the European Union expanded eastward. It felt like a period of unshakable, permanent optimism.
The optimism was pervasive, yeah. And it actually culminated in a moment of unprecedented solidarity immediately following the September 11 attacks in 2001.
Right, 9/11.
Because for the first and only time in its history, NATO invoked Article 5.
And that's the foundational principle that an armed attack against one member is considered an attack against them all, right?
Exactly. And European nations rallied behind Washington without hesitation. However, the data shows that this unity was structurally fragile, because less than 2 years later, the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq shattered the consensus entirely.
Yeah, so the Bush administration, with prominent backing from the UK, made the decision to initiate a preemptive war against Iraq. And crucially, they bypassed the United Nations Security Council after failing to secure authorization.
Right.
And they proceeded in the face of massive, highly vocal opposition from two of America's oldest, most strategically vital allies, France and Germany.
The resulting diplomatic fallout was arguably the most severe rupture in the post-war era. I mean, the defining moment of the schism occurred at the United Nations.
Oh, the speech.
Yes. French Foreign Minister Dominique de Villepin delivered this soaring, impassioned speech explicitly rejecting the rush to war, and the retaliation from Washington was swift, at least rhetorically.
Right, Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah, U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld publicly cleaved the alliance in two. He contrasted what he called Old Europe,
which was specifically France and Germany.
right, framing them as stagnant, overly cautious, and historically exhausted. And he contrasted them against New Europe, referring to the newer Eastern European NATO members who actually supported the U.S. intervention.
Which is just, I mean, dismissing your most powerful democratic partners as old Europe simply because they demand a UN mandate is a stunningly abrasive diplomatic maneuver.
It was incredibly blunt.
But I have to ask, why did this specific disagreement cause such a lasting, deep-seated trauma? On the surface, allies disagree on military tactics all the time, right?
They do, but the underlying documentation reveals that this was never merely a tactical disagreement about troop deployments or intelligence assessments.
Yeah.
It was a profound, irreconcilable collision of political philosophies regarding the very nature of international order.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that philosophical collision. How were their worldviews so fundamentally misaligned?
Well, the United States, particularly under the Bush Doctrine at that time, was operating on a framework that prioritized unilateral action and preemption.
They're cursed.
Exactly. The prevailing view in Washington was that if a latent threat exists, American military supremacy is the ultimate necessary guarantor of security, and that power should not be vetoed by international committees.
Right.
Western Europe, conversely, had spent the entire post-World War II era building a completely different framework. They prioritized international law, strict multilateralism, and the principle of proportionality. For European leaders, the legal justification and the diplomatic process were just as vital as the military objective itself.
Which, if we trace the history of the European project, makes perfect sense. The European Union was essentially constructed as a machine to tame state violence.
Yes.
They had nearly destroyed the continent twice in 30 years through unilateral military aggression. So their entire modern identity was built on restraining the use of force through institutions.
Precisely the underlying mechanism. I mean, the European project was designed to make war structurally impossible by binding nations together legally and economically.
Right.
So when the U.S. decided to bypass the UN Security Council, they weren't just disagreeing on a policy, they were bypassing the exact institutional framework that Europe viewed as the pinnacle of human progress.
I'm trying to view this from the American perspective at the time, though. I imagine policymakers in Washington viewed the European stance as incredibly naive.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, in the shadow of 9/11, wasn't Europe just prioritizing bureaucratic procedure over actual physical security? Why did European leaders view American preemption as a fundamental betrayal rather than just a pragmatic necessity in a really dangerous world?
Because it exposed a terrifying reality about the power dynamic within the alliance. Having a partner who is vastly stronger than you is comforting when they operate within your shared rules.
Right.
But when that partner demonstrates a willingness to use overwhelming force outside of those rules, the dynamic shifts from protection to vulnerability.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Europe suddenly realized that the American military apparatus could operate completely independent of European moral or legal constraints, potentially igniting regional chaos that Europe, due to its geographical proximity to the Middle East, would ultimately have to manage.
That makes the family analogy incredibly potent. It's like discovering during a sudden crisis that your older sibling doesn't just prefer a different tactic, but they fundamentally reject the concept of a family discussion.
Exactly.
You want to sit down and build a consensus, and they simply kick the front door off its hinges, declare the rules void, and start breaking things, leaving you to sweep up the glass.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And the historical record shows that the lingering effects of 2003 established a deep, abiding suspicion in European capitals that American unilateralism is inherently destabilizing.
While at the same time,
Concurrently, the legacy in Washington was a solidified perception of Europe as a continent of moralizing free riders.
right.
Allies who are perfectly content to critique American actions from the safety of the American security umbrella, but who are unwilling to get their hands dirty to actually maintain global order.
Which is a huge rift. And this philosophical rupture over hard military power leads us directly into the next massive layer of our analysis. Because while Europe aggressively pushed back against American military dominance in the geopolitical arena, they simultaneously found themselves completely and inescapably enveloped by American cultural and technological dominance.
Yeah, we are transitioning from hard power to soft power here, and specifically to structural platform power. The documentation highlights a fascinating, enduring paradox. Europe possesses an insatiable appetite for American cultural exports, yet harbors a deep structural resentment toward American power.
And disentangling the two has proven nearly impossible.
Politically impossible, yes.
Historically, this defensive posture was focused on traditional media and entertainment. We're talking about the massive influx of Hollywood cinema, American pop music, fast food conglomerates.
Right.
A prime example is the approach taken by France. To defend their cultural heritage from being suffocated by the global reach of the American entertainment industry, the French government implemented strict, legally binding radio quotas. Broadcasters were mandated to dedicate a significant percentage of their airtime exclusively to French-language music. It was a literal legislative moat built to hold back the tide of Disney and MTV.
Yeah, and that concept of cultural defense is known in France as the exception culturelle, the idea that cultural goods cannot be treated merely as commercial commodities on a free market.
Right.
But, as we move into the 21st century, the battlefield has fundamentally shifted.
Yeah.
We are no longer debating pop songs or cinema screams. The new arena is digital infrastructure.
Today, the daily functioning of European society, its citizens, its media landscape, commercial enterprises, and even its government communications operates almost entirely on digital platforms engineered, owned, and controlled by American technology giants.
And the level of infrastructural reliance is truly staggering. Consequently, the European Union's defensive strategy has evolved from cultural quotas to sweeping, aggressive economic and structural regulation.
Like the DMA.
Exactly. The most prominent mechanism currently reshaping this dynamic is the Digital Markets Act, or the DMA. Through this legislation, the EU has explicitly designated certain massive tech companies as gatekeepers.
And that list primarily includes American titans, right? Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft.
Yes.
The term gatekeeper is incredibly evocative. But mechanically, how does this legislation actually work? What is Europe forcing these American companies to do?
Well, the DMA essentially functions as a set of stringent building codes applied to digital monopolies. To use the analogy of a digital town square, if an American company owns the square, the DMA prevents them from dictating who can set up a market stall or from giving their own stalls preferential placement.
Oh, I see.
Mechanically, it forces interoperability, meaning dominant messaging apps might have to allow users from smaller competing apps to send messages to their networks.
Whoa.
It strictly prohibits self-preferencing, meaning a company like Apple cannot unfairly prioritize its own native applications over third-party alternatives in its App Store. And a search engine cannot prioritize its own shopping services in the search results.
So when we analyze this through the lens of transatlantic relations, this isn't just standard, dry antitrust policy. It feels like a profoundly philosophical statement.
It really is. It's the modern manifestation of the French radio quotas, elevated to the level of global infrastructure. American influence operates simultaneously on three distinct levels across the Atlantic: as a military protector, as a technological role model, and as a constant provocation. In many respects, modern European political identity is actively forged through its resistance to American corporate hegemony.
So by imposing the DMA, Europe is essentially saying, we acknowledge that we are entirely dependent on your digital tools to run our societies, but we're going to use the power of the state to force your capitalist creations to operate within our specific moral and regulatory framework.
Exactly.
It's an assertion of digital sovereignty.
It is a clash of core values. The EU is prioritizing user privacy, market fairness, and the authority of the democratic state over the unchecked expansion of the corporate entity. They are attempting to retroactively install European values into American software.
I have to play the role of the skeptical observer here, though.
Please do.
If European leaders resent this technological dominance so intensely, and if they feel their sovereignty is genuinely threatened by these American gatekeepers, why hasn't Europe managed to build its own Silicon Valley?
Right, that's the big question.
I look at the incredible intellectual capital in universities across Europe, the wealth of the continent, the history of scientific discovery. Is this instinct to heavily regulate simply a bureaucratic substitute for a fundamental inability to innovate? Are they essentially just writing rules for the castles they forgot how to build?
That specific critique is raised frequently by American technology executives and policymakers. The prevailing narrative in Silicon Valley views Europe as a regulatory museum.
A museum, wow.
Yeah. A continent that has lost its entrepreneurial drive and compensates by tying down American innovators with red tape. However, the data provides a much more nuanced explanation regarding the mechanics of this innovation gap.
What is the mechanical difference then? Why did the tech boom happen in California and not in Berlin or Paris?
It essentially comes down to a fundamental societal trade-off between explosive innovation and social stability. The American model, particularly in Silicon Valley, thrives on an ecosystem of massive, high-risk venture capital where failure is almost celebrated as a necessary step toward disruption.
Move fast and break things.
Exactly. The labor market is highly fluid, allowing companies to scale up massively and fire thousands of workers just as quickly if a pivot is required. The social safety net is minimal, which creates a high-stakes, hyper-competitive environment.
Right. It's an environment optimized for taking massive swings, knowing you might strike out completely.
Conversely, the European structural model is engineered for security. Europe prioritizes robust social safety nets, stringent labor protections that make it very difficult to suddenly terminate a workforce, and a more conservative financial sector.
They're highly averse to risk.
Very averse to the kind of speculative risk required to fund 100 startups just to find one unicorn. Plus, the societal stigma attached to bankruptcy in many European cultures is significantly higher.
So the lack of a European Google isn't a failure of intellect. It's the intended outcome of a specific societal design. Europe deliberately traded the chaotic, explosive potential of hyperinnovation in exchange for long-term social stability and worker protection.
The trade-off achieved its goal, honestly. European societies generally boast higher markers of equality, work-life balance, and baseline security. But the inescapable consequence of that trade-off is technological dependency.
Right.
They rely on the digital infrastructure birthed by a nation whose chaotic winner-take-all ethos they fundamentally distrust.
And because the daily lives of citizens on both sides of the Atlantic are now completely mediated by these very same tech platforms, it brings us to a critical inflection point in our analysis. The way Americans and Europeans perceive one another is no longer shaped by thoughtful diplomacy or direct interaction. It has been entirely hijacked by the algorithmic echo chamber.
This represents a vital shift in the geopolitical landscape. I mean, we've explored the historical rifts and the structural economic differences, but the average citizen does not experience these differences by reading policy papers.
No, they definitely don't.
They experience them through a highly calibrated technological filter that is mathematically designed to distort reality.
To understand the damage this causes, we have to clearly define the mechanism. The algorithms powering modern social media do not optimize for truth, nor do they optimize for a nuanced understanding of transatlantic relations.
Right. They optimize for engagement.
Exactly. They feed on provocation, they aggressively promote outrage, and they validate existing confirmation biases. Because strong negative emotions are the most effective way to keep a user scrolling and viewing advertisements.
Let's examine exactly what this algorithmic mechanism feeds to each side of the alliance. When an average American opens their smartphone, the curated feed they receive regarding Europe is profoundly skewed.
How so?
Well, it generally falls into two distinct categories. The first is crisis journalism. The algorithm prioritizes imagery of terror attacks in major capitals, the chaotic political fallout of Brexit, massive labor strikes shutting down transportation, or violent riots in the streets of Paris.
The algorithm surfaces chaos because chaos holds the attention.
Right.
But what about the political projections? How does American domestic politics warp the view of Europe?
The data shows that the algorithm serves different versions of Europe depending on the American user's political leanings. For American conservatives, the algorithm curates a feed presenting Europe as a terrifying cautionary tale. They are bombarded with content depicting out-of-control socialist welfare states allegedly dragging down innovation, or heavily edited videos framing European cities as collapsing under the weight of unchecked immigration and the loss of national identity.
Oh, so it provides confirmation bias for their domestic arguments against taxation and open borders.
Exactly. Meanwhile, for American progressives, the algorithm serves up an equally distorted utopian dream.
Right, the Scandinavian paradise.
Right. They are fed a continuous loop of immaculate, high-speed public transit in Scandinavia, universal healthcare systems functioning without a single flaw, and an idyllic paradise of state-mandated work-life balance and environmental perfection.
And neither of these highly curated feeds represents the complex, often mundane reality of actual life in Europe.
Not at all. Europe is reduced to a convenient rhetorical prop used to win arguments in American domestic politics.
Now, if the American view of Europe is distorted by domestic politics, the European algorithmic view of the United States seems entirely dominated by what we might call the outrage loop. What exactly does the algorithm decide to show a citizen in London or Munich about life in America?
The mechanism feeds Europeans a relentless, highly concentrated diet of America's deepest, most tragic societal dysfunctions. A European user's feed is saturated with a daily loop of devastating mass shootings, horrific, graphic instances of police violence, vicious culture war screaming matches, the devastating toll of the opioid crisis, and the most extreme incendiary political rhetoric available.
Often centered around figures like Donald Trump, I assume.
Very often, yes.
It creates a terrifying funhouse mirror. Like if you are sitting in a cafe in Berlin, sipping a coffee and scrolling through your feed, the algorithm isn't showing you the quiet, methodical tech entrepreneur in Austin, Texas, or the peaceful, boring reality of a suburban neighborhood in Ohio.
No, it's not.
It's curating a terrifying montage of a nation that appears to be actively, violently tearing itself apart in real time.
And the psychological impact of consuming that concentrated feed daily is immense. This phenomenon generates a fascinating irony regarding political discourse, which the documentation actually highlights. The pervasive anti-Americanism in Europe, fueled by these images of societal collapse, paradoxically utilizes American cultural terminology.
Wait, explain how that works. How can they be anti-American while adopting the culture?
Well, when European citizens and politicians debate their own complex domestic issues of race, class, history, and integration, they increasingly import American conceptual frameworks.
Really?
Yeah. We see robust European debates utilizing terms like Black Lives Matter, cancel culture, wokeism, and identity politics. Europe is increasingly processing its own internal conflicts through American-produced vernacular and categories, even as it explicitly criticizes the American society that birthed those concepts.
It's a bizarre form of cultural colonization. They're using the exact vocabulary of the empire to criticize the empire.
That's a great way to put it.
But beyond the linguistic irony, what is the geopolitical danger of this algorithmic distortion?
The danger is existential to the alliance because the algorithm fundamentally transforms structural differences into moral judgments.
Okay, let's clearly define the difference between a structural observation and a moral judgment in this context.
Sure. A structural objective observation would be the European model invests heavily in domestic welfare programs, while the United States model invests heavily in global military power projection.
Right, that is a neutral assessment of differing priorities.
Exactly. However, when that structural difference is filtered through an algorithm optimized for outrage, it mutates into a moral judgment.
How does mutate?
The American feed frames the European as a lazy, parasitic free rider, entirely dependent on American blood and treasure. The European feed frames the American as a violent, unprincipled, gun-obsessed imperialist with no regard for human life.
The nuance is completely pulverized.
When a population consumes a daily, algorithmic diet showcasing only the absolute worst attributes of their ally, they stop viewing that ally as a partner with a different historical trajectory or a different set of complex policy challenges.
Right. They begin to view their ally as morally bankrupt. They begin to assume bad faith in every interaction. And history demonstrates that once a foundational alliance loses the baseline assumption of mutual good faith, the structure begins to rot from the inside out.
And if you consider your own scrolling habits, it becomes immediately apparent. You aren't seeing the average Tuesday in an Ohio suburb or the routine grocery shopping in a Swedish town. You are consuming the absolute extreme 1% of their worst possible days, perfectly curated to trigger your amygdala and make you angry.
Because anger guarantees engagement.
Exactly. And that monetized anger is slowly, mechanically eroding the bedrock of Western solidarity.
Which transitions us perfectly to the next major revelation drawn from our analysis. This algorithmic outrage loop does not simply amplify the distrust crossing the Atlantic. It actively accelerates massive internal political fracturing within Europe itself.
Which is fascinating. Our traditional mental model of geopolitics usually pits the U.S. on one side of the chessboard and a united, cohesive Europe on the other. The classic two-bloc mentality. We assume they operate as solid, unified entities.
But an analysis of the internal political dynamics reveals a completely different map. The most significant political fault lines do not divide the continents. They run directly across the Atlantic Ocean. To truly understand this structural shift, we have to examine the catalyst of migration and the resulting internal identity crisis that fractured the European Union.
Right. And the historical data pinpoints a very specific, undeniable inflection point, the 2015 refugee crisis.
Right.
We are talking about the sudden, highly visible arrival of over 1 million asylum seekers in Europe within a very compressed time frame. The vast majority of these individuals were fleeing the brutal realities of the Syrian civil war alongside broader instability across the Middle East and North Africa.
The sheer logistical and demographic scale of that migration created an unprecedented stress test for the European Union. It brutally exposed the reality that the EU, despite achieving remarkable economic integration and a shared currency, harbored wildly incompatible political and cultural philosophies among its member states.
Completely incompatible.
Especially regarding the definition of national identity, the purpose of borders, and the obligations of the state.
And the breakdown of the institutional mechanisms was immediate. The Dublin regulation, which theoretically required asylum seekers to process their claims in the first EU country they entered, just completely collapsed under the weight of the numbers.
It was overwhelmed.
Yeah. And this logistical failure forced a massive ideological split. On one side, you had the approach championed by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, which became known as the Merkel Line.
What exactly did the Merkel Line entail?
Chancellor Merkel effectively suspended the Dublin rules and advocated for relatively open borders for the refugees. Her policy was driven by a complex mixture of philosophies.
Like what?
A deep-seated sense of humanitarian duty, an acute awareness of Germany's historical responsibilities, and, practically speaking, an understanding of Germany's impending demographic crisis and the need for a massive influx of labor.
But that unilateral decision sent shockwaves through the rest of the bloc. Because on the exact opposite end of the ideological spectrum, you had the Visegrad Group. For context, the Visegrad Group is an alliance consisting of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic.
And the Visegrad nations fundamentally and aggressively rejected the Merkel Line. When the EU attempted to implement mandatory quotas to distribute the refugees evenly across the member states, these countries refused to comply.
They just said no.
Yes. They framed the influx not as a humanitarian crisis to be managed, but as a direct, existential threat to their national sovereignty and their cultural homogeneity.
To understand their fierce resistance, we really have to look at their specific historical mechanism. These are nations that spent decades trapped behind the Iron Curtain, having their borders, their economies, and their political systems dictated by a supranational power in Moscow.
Exactly.
So the idea of finally achieving sovereign, homogeneous nation-states, only to have a new supranational power, this time in Brussels, dictate mandatory demographic shifts that trigger deep historical anxieties.
That historical context is crucial. This migration crisis became the ultimate insurmountable wedge issue. It deeply weakened the internal trust required for the EU to govern collectively.
And critically, moving back to our transatlantic focus, this internal European crisis provided American populist conservatives, most notably Donald Trump, with a powerful, real-time narrative tool.
The rhetoric was unmistakable. Trump and his allies constantly pointed to the challenges faced by European cities struggling with the sudden influx of migrants.
Right, highlighting integration issues or isolated incidents of unrest.
Exactly, and they weaponized those images to warn American voters against liberal immigration policies at the U.S. southern border. The internal struggles of Europe were drafted into service as ammunition for American domestic political warfare.
Concurrently, within Europe, this exact issue fueled an incredible continent-wide surge of national populism. The political landscape was permanently altered as voters reacted to the perceived loss of border control. This era catalyzed the rise of figures like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, propelled Marine Le Pen's movement into the mainstream in France, granted unprecedented influence to the Sweden Democrats, and recently led to the electoral success of Geert Wilders in the Netherlands.
If we look at the data objectively, this fundamentally dismantles the entire premise of a unified U.S. versus Europe dynamic. That outdated Cold War paradigm simply does not map onto reality anymore.
So what is the new map?
It is a battle between two highly coordinated transatlantic coalitions. On one side, you have the liberal internationalists. This coalition exists on both sides of the ocean. They generally believe in the necessity of multilateral institutions like the UN and the EU. They advocate for open, globalized trade, and they support progressive, regulated approaches to social issues and migration.
And on the other side, you have the national populists, who are equally coordinated across the Atlantic.
This is a critical realignment. The analysis suggests that Viktor Orban's government in Hungary is philosophically, tactically, and rhetorically much closer to the Mangier movement in the United States than it is to the liberal government of Emmanuel Macron in France.
The connectivity between these populist movements isn't just like a vague alignment of ideas either. It is highly operational. They actively share political playbooks.
They do.
European populist leaders meticulously study the media strategies of the American right, and the American right actively courts European populists. The networks are deeply intertwined.
We've seen political strategists like Steve Bannon attempt to build formal academies for European nationalist movements.
Right, and we see prominent American media figures like Tucker Carlson broadcasting directly from Budapest, praising the Hungarian model.
Exactly. The confrontational alternative media ecosystem pioneered in the U.S. is actively being exported to and adapted by European parties. Both factions within this transatlantic populist coalition share a profound skepticism of supranational institutions, a deep distrust of legacy media, and a shared narrative that positions them against a cosmopolitan, out-of-touch global elite.
And as objective analysts, we must be exceptionally clear. Our role is not to validate or condemn the policy goals of the liberal internationalists, nor are we validating or condemning the national populists.
Right.
Our task is to map the terrain based on the data.
Right.
And the data demonstrates unequivocally that ideological alignment is rapidly superseding geographic proximity as the primary unifying force in Western politics.
Returning to our opening analogy of the fractured family, the dynamic is no longer a simple feud between the American parents and the European children. It has evolved into a bitter civil war inside the house. You have cousins across the ocean actively teaming up with each other to fight against their own siblings sitting right next to them. The family dinner table is completely fractured. Everyone is screaming at the relative across the table while furiously nodding in agreement with a political ally on a screen 4,000 miles away.
That captures the structural reality perfectly. And this deep-seated internal fracturing leads us to the most pressing, unavoidable question of our current era. Because all of these converging crises, the populist divisions, the algorithmic erosion of truth, the lingering resentments over technological dominance and military unilateralism, they all culminate in the ultimate stress test.
They really do.
The question hanging over every geopolitical calculation in 2026 is this: when a brutal, industrialized, hard power war actually returns to the European continent, can this fractured, internally divided, highly resentful family still rely on the fundamental mechanisms of their alliance?
That brings us to the ultimate reality check, the war in Ukraine.
February 2022, Russia's full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. In a matter of hours, the core underlying illusion of the entire modern European project was shattered.
Absolutely shattered.
For decades, Europe had operated under the assumption of a perpetual Kantian peace on the continent. The belief was that economic interdependence and the memory of the world wars had rendered large-scale territorial conquest obsolete.
The psychological shock to the European system was total. War, not a localized skirmish, but a massive industrialized 20th century-style land war with artillery barrages and tank columns, had returned to their immediate borders.
And the resulting policy shifts were instantaneous and drastic, most notably in Berlin. The German government announced what they termed a Zeitenwende.
And the term Zeitenwende translates to a historical turning point, or a fundamental change of an era.
For Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe, this wasn't just a rhetorical shift, right? It required mechanically dismantling decades of entrenched foreign and economic policy.
It was a complete reversal.
Since the end of the Cold War, Germany had anchored its security strategy on a philosophy known as Wandel durch Handel, change through trade.
Right.
The core mechanism of this theory was that by deeply integrating their energy infrastructure with Russia, by making Moscow economically dependent on selling cheap gas to German factories, they would make war mathematically irrational. They believed the pipeline was the ultimate peace treaty.
But when Russian tanks crossed the border, that entire philosophical architecture collapsed.
Overnight.
Germany realized instantly that soft power, diplomatic summits, and deep economic integration provide absolutely zero deterrence against an adversary willing to absorb economic ruin to achieve territorial conquest.
Right.
In response, Germany pledged a massive, unprecedented infusion of capital into its defense budget, reversing a decades-long trend of military stagnation.
But the invasion didn't just force Europe to reevaluate its relationship with Russia. The data highlights that the war brutally exposed a glaring, undeniable vulnerability within the alliance itself. It exposed the absolute depth of Europe's strategic and logistical dependence on the United States military apparatus.
It did. Despite years of sophisticated rhetoric in Brussels regarding strategic autonomy and European sovereignty, when a massive land war erupted on their doorstep, the reality of the balance sheets became undeniable.
They just didn't have the gear.
Europe realized very quickly that they lacked the fundamental mechanisms of modern warfare. They did not possess the deep stockpiles of artillery ammunition, the heavy-lift logistical capabilities, the advanced satellite intelligence architecture, or the sheer brute force industrial capacity required to continuously supply the Ukrainian military while maintaining credible deterrence for their own territories.
If we look at the state of the Bundeswehr, the German armed forces, prior to the invasion, there were widely circulated reports of units using painted broomsticks instead of heavy machine guns during NATO training exercises.
Because of severe equipment shortages, yes.
The gap between European diplomatic ambition and European military capability was an abyss. They needed the United States to step in desperately and immediately.
But here's where the stress test truly begins. The United States that Europe called upon in 2022 and the United States operating in 2026 is not the United States of 1989.
The domestic political climate in Washington has fundamentally transformed.
Exactly. The bipartisan consensus on global American leadership is fractured. We see powerful political factions, heavily influenced by the rhetoric of Donald Trump and the populist wing, actively and publicly questioning the intrinsic value of American support for Ukraine.
The argument being made in Washington is purely transactional. They frame the billions of dollars in military aid as a massive, unsustainable drain on the American taxpayer, subsidizing a conflict that, geographically and historically, should be Europe's primary responsibility to manage.
And the mere articulation of that argument by mainstream American political figures sends absolute shockwaves through the corridors of power in European capitals. The documentation notes that for the first time since the end of the Second World War, serious, pragmatic European leaders and defense planners are asking a previously unthinkable question out loud.
Which is
the United States of America still a reliable partner?
wow. If the United States is demonstrating a political willingness to reconsider its commitment to European security in the middle of the largest land war in 80 years, European planners are forced to calculate what else Washington might abandon when domestic politics dictate a retreat.
Right.
This has elevated discussions about an independent European defense, from academic thought experiments to urgent existential requirements.
And this vulnerability reveals an incredibly uncomfortable truth regarding the foundation of modern European identity. Europe was able to cultivate its identity as a peaceful, highly civilized, rule-abiding continent, a paradise of diplomacy, high-speed rail, and robust welfare states, only because they had effectively outsourced the grim, brutal, staggeringly expensive logic of hard-powered deterrence to the Pentagon.
To the U.S. taxpayer, essentially.
Exactly. Europe had the luxury of becoming a peace project precisely because America was willing to remain a power project.
The mechanism of their prosperity was heavily subsidized by American military expenditure. But now, that American power project is signaling, quite loudly, that it is growing weary of carrying the burden for allies it views as perpetually wealthy but militarily negligent.
The crisis we are analyzing isn't simply a logistical shortfall of 155mm artillery shells or anti-aircraft batteries, though those deficits are severe.
So what is the true crisis?
The true crisis is the rapid evaporation of institutional trust. Trust is a mechanism that requires decades of consistent action to construct, but it can be dismantled in a single election cycle.
Yeah.
When a European defense minister sits down today to map out procurement for the next 20 years, they can no longer operate on the baseline assumption that the U.S. cavalry will always arrive. They are being forced to strategize for a world where the United States, consumed by internal political dysfunction or pivoting entirely to counter China in the Pacific, might simply decide to walk away.
So the critical question is Europe actually waking up and taking the difficult, politically unpopular steps to build a credible deterrent? Or are they simply scrambling in a state of geopolitical shock because the massive security umbrella they have casually stood under for 70 years is suddenly full of holes and the storm is already here?
The evidence points to a combination of both. There is a genuine awakening occurring. Defense budgets across almost every NATO member state are surging, with nations finally meeting or exceeding the mandate to spend 2% of their GDP on defense.
Which they hadn't done for years.
Right. Production lines for munitions are being restarted. However, the anxiety is profound because you cannot simply will a defense industrial base into existence overnight. Rebuilding the supply chains, the manufacturing capacity, and the logistical networks required to defend a continent is a mechanical process that takes a decade or more.
And Europe is painfully aware that they might not have a decade to prepare, which perfectly sets the stage for our final phase of analysis.
Yep.
Given this unprecedented stress test, given the deep populist divisions, the algorithmic erosion of shared reality, the lingering cultural resentments, and the brutal reawakening to hard power in Ukraine, how does the transatlantic relationship fundamentally adapt to survive the 21st century?
Especially as the United States actively and undeniably pivots its grand strategic focus away from the Atlantic Ocean and toward the Indo-Pacific to manage the rise of China.
Let's examine the three potential pathways the data outlines.
The geopolitical modeling provides three distinct scenarios for how this foundational relationship might evolve over the coming decades. These models offer a vital framework for understanding the trajectory we are currently navigating.
Let's explore the first pathway. What does the optimistic model look like?
The first scenario is defined as renewed relevance, or moderate normalization. In this model, the shock of the Ukraine war serves as a permanent positive catalyst. Europe internalizes the reality of its vulnerability and successfully builds a credible, highly integrated military deterrent. By taking true responsibility for securing its own neighborhood, Europe effectively frees the United States to confidently shift its heavy military assets to the Indo-Pacific without leaving a power vacuum in the West.
So it evolves into a more balanced partnership. The U.S. handles the Pacific theater, Europe secures the continent, and they collaborate heavily on economic security, specifically coordinating a massive de-risking strategy to protect critical supply chains and technology from Chinese dominance.
That is the ideal outcome, a partnership of equals sharing the burden of global stability.
Sounds nice.
But the second scenario, however, is defined as benign neglect, or institutional adaptation.
If the first scenario is a renewed partnership, I assume the second is a slow, quiet drifting apart.
Exactly. In this model, there is no dramatic rupture. The United States formally maintains its NATO commitments and leaves a token force in Europe, but the political willpower, the massive financial resources, and the grand strategic focus shift permanently and entirely to Asia.
So Europe just kind of manages on its own.
Pretty much. Europe manages to remain relatively safe, perhaps through a combination of increased spending and diplomatic maneuvering, but it becomes geopolitically passive. The alliance isn't destroyed, it is hollowed out from the inside.
The documentation uses a poignant analogy for this model. It describes a family that still shares a last name, still sends a polite holiday card every December, but essentially lives entirely separate lives on opposite sides of the country. They share a profound history, but they no longer share a common destiny.
It is a slow fade into irrelevance. And then we must examine the third pathway, which the models define as strategic decoupling or real fracture.
This is the dark timeline. How does the fracture mechanically occur?
In this scenario, isolationist and populist political forces gain dominant, sustained control in Washington. The United States aggressively turns inward, viewing global alliances purely as financial liabilities. Then, a sudden, acute crisis strikes Europe, perhaps a renewed, highly aggressive Russian maneuver against a vulnerable NATO state in the Baltics, testing the perimeter.
And in this timeline, the mechanism of Article 5 fails.
The U.S. response is sluggish, highly conditional, mired in domestic political gridlock, and ultimately entirely inadequate to deter the threat. The bluff is called, and the mechanism fails.
Oh, man.
The immediate result is the fundamental collapse of the European security order. Europe realizes, with terrifying clarity, that it is truly alone. This forces an incredibly chaotic, panicked, and financially ruinous remilitarization across the continent, severely fracturing the internal political landscape of the European Union as nations scramble to secure their own borders.
When we evaluate these three divergent paths, there is a fascinating psychological undercurrent driving the data. The analysts describe a phenomenon they call the asymmetry of longing.
The asymmetry of longing is perhaps the most profound insight into the emotional reality of geopolitics. Europe, particularly the older generation of European policymakers and citizens, harbors a deep, profound nostalgia for the reliable, deeply engaged America of the Cold War. They long for the America that engineered the Marshall Plan, the America of John F. Kennedy standing in West Berlin, the America of Ronald Reagan demanding the dismantling of the Iron Curtain. They desperately miss the hyper-competent older brother who was always guaranteed to arrive and stabilize the situation.
But the hard truth is that America does not share that nostalgia. America does not miss Europe in the same way.
It structurally cannot, because the United States never possessed the same existential survival-level need for Europe that Europe held for the United States.
Right, because of the geography.
Exactly. For Washington, Europe was an incredibly vital strategic theater in a global ideological struggle, but it was still one theater among many. For Europe, the presence of the United States was the literal physical guarantor of their continued existence and prosperity.
You cannot have a symmetrical longing when the dependency was almost entirely one-sided for 7 decades. If we look objectively at the demographic data today, it is hard not to wonder which of these paths is already locked in. The demographic mechanisms at play in the United States are undeniable and irreversible. America is becoming a vastly more diverse nation, with its population growth driven by citizens whose ancestry traces back to Latin America, to Asia, and to Africa rather than to Europe.
Right.
The upcoming generations of American voters and the politicians who will represent them do not have grandparents who stormed the beaches of Normandy. Their cultural and familial roots do not inherently pull them across the Atlantic.
Their natural strategic and economic gaze is directed south toward Latin America and west toward the Pacific Rim.
When you combine that profound demographic transformation with the undeniable reality that the center of global economic gravity is shifted permanently to Asia, that second scenario, benign neglect. The slow, polite drifting apart of the family feels less like a conscious political choice to be debated and far more like a structural inevitability. The gravitational pull of the 21st century is simply dragging the United States toward the Pacific. And no amount of heartfelt nostalgia for the triumphs of the 20th century can reverse the mathematical reality of demographics and economics.
The era of relying on historical momentum to sustain the alliance is permanently closed. Moving forward, the relationship will have to be renegotiated from the ground up based on starkly transactional terms and coldly aligned interests rather than shared sentiment.
We've covered an immense expanse of historical and analytical ground today. Let's briefly retrace the map we've drawn.
Let's do it.
We began by analyzing the severe philosophical rupture of the 2003 Iraq War, mapping the moment the Allies realized their fundamental frameworks for utilizing power were incompatible.
We unpacked the invisible, pervasive infrastructure of American technological platforms and the EU's regulatory attempts to build digital building codes.
We explored the mechanics of the algorithmic echo chambers, demonstrating how optimizing for outrage distorts our mutual reality and transforms structural differences into moral rot.
We traced how the 2015 migration crisis overwhelmed European institutions, sparking an internal identity crisis that fueled a highly coordinated transatlantic populist coalition.
We examined the brutal reality check of the war in Ukraine, which laid bare Europe's critical vulnerability and the potential unreliability of the American security umbrella.
And finally, we mapped the divergent pathways of the future, driven by shifting demographics and the asymmetry of longing.
It's a relationship in the midst of a profound, highly volatile transition. The foundational pillars are being tested simultaneously by internal division and external aggression.
It's really the ultimate test.
Which leaves us with a final lingering thought to process as you look at the world tomorrow. For over 70 years, we have casually, almost reflexively utilized the phrase, the West.
Right.
We hear it constantly in political discourse. The West must respond to this crisis. The West believes in these values. We use the term as shorthand to describe a united, impenetrable fortress encompassing North America and Western Europe. A singular, cohesive geopolitical entity bound permanently by shared Enlightenment principles and mutual defense.
But as the demographic makeup of the United States continues its permanent shift away from European origins, as the algorithmic outrage loop continuously erodes the baseline of mutual trust, and as the sheer weight of global economic and military power consolidates in the Pacific,
we have to ask, does the West, as a unified, actionable concept, actually exist anymore?
that's the real question.
Or are we living through the exact imperceptible moment where the very concept of the West ceases to be a functional geopolitical reality and begins its transition into nothing more than a chapter title in a 20th century history textbook?
Wow.
It is the ultimate question of whether a house divided by history, filtered through technology, and pulled apart by shifting global horizons can realistically continue to call itself a single home. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive today on Topic Lens. Keep questioning the algorithms that shape your feed, keep digging beneath the explosive headlines, and keep searching for the true structural context of the world you live in.